Do you have a TI-99? Does your TI-99 use disk-based storage? If you answered yes to either of those questions, it might be time to explore the exciting world of disk operating systems, where file systems aren't just a place to dump your data, they're a one-stop shop for all your computing needs. And the good news is, nowadays, Force Command from Matt Splett is a great way to get your DOS-style command line on a TI-99. But before I put Force Command to work and show you what it can do today, let's take a look back at the disk operating system options the TI-99 gave us in its own time. When TI made the TI-99, the ease of use a command module offered was pretty central to the whole design. And while disks were there almost from the start, they weren't the focus. When the TI-99 4A released, machine language programs on disk didn't exist at all. So that being the case, most of the time when someone says operating system while talking about the TI-99, what they're talking about is the operating system in ROM on the TI-99 mainboard. That gives you all the support routines you need for things like system startup and programming in BASIC. And it does even give BASIC the ability to read and write from a disk. But while TI BASIC has an interactive mode which serves as a sort of command prompt, the only thing it can do with a disk is load a BASIC program and save it. Most of the things you'd want a disk operating system to do are not on offer. And even in 1981, when the TI-99 4A made its debut, the microcomputer world did know what a disk operating system looked like. TRS-DOS and Apple-DOS had been evolving on their platforms. But more importantly, the king of the command prompt, CP/M, was available on Apple II with the help of a Microsoft Z80 soft card. So even in 1981, you'd be justified in asking, why shouldn't my TI-99 4A have CP/M too, so I can manage files and disks and run popular programs, all from one command line? Well, one reason why not is, when TI went shopping for a cross-platform disk-based development environment, what they landed on was the UCSD P system, a solution that almost nobody ended up using, unfortunately. But even if TI had wanted to put CP/M on the TI-99, there would have been some issues. The TI-99 was not CP/M's native architecture. CP/M was developed for Intel's 8080 and compatibles. And the TI-9900 CPU was a completely different beast. Still, TI or a third party could have worked around that problem, the exact same way Microsoft got around it on the Apple II with the Z80 soft card, just adding the architecture CP/M needed on an expansion board. And in the end, someone did do exactly that. In July '83, Morningstar Software announced their CP/M soft card for the TI-99 4A, under the tagline, "Now your TI-99 4A really means business." And the $595 price tag is pretty hefty here, but maybe worth it if you really want to run CP/M programs, and you've already got a peripheral expansion box for your TI-99. In the long run, Morningstar wasn't alone in thinking this was worth doing. In January '85, Foundation Computer announced they had a CP/M card available too. An idea so nice they tried it twice. But by 1985, CP/M was kind of on the way out. The IBM PC had gone its own way with MS-DOS, and both MS-DOS and the IBM PC were consequently on the rise. So adding CP/M to your TI-99 in 1985 doesn't really feel like keeping up with the Joneses. But it was a disk operating system and a command line environment for your TI-99, for whatever that was worth. With MS-DOS and the PC taking control of the business market, in 1987, TI developers took another swing at that DOS thing, with 4A-DOS, aka Command DOS. That released in 1987, and unlike the CP/M cards, it was a native TI-99 solution, written and designed for the architecture. What you get when you start up Command DOS is a piece of software that does its best to do what you'd expect a DOS to do in 1987. There's even an auto-bat file that runs whatever commands you want it to run at every startup, like any DOS ought to have. Otherwise, you've naturally got a prompt that tells you what disk you have selected, and from there you can copy or delete or rename files and all the other disk operating system stuff you'd expect. The features aren't endless, but they've all been designed with TI computing in mind. And you've even got an 80-column mode for folks with 80-column hardware. So if you were looking for a command line disk operating system on the TI-99, CP/M and 4A DOS gave you some options, even in the 80s. But by the late 80s, GUI-driven operating systems were obviously taken over. So why not try to build on one of those instead? Well, the closest thing to an answer there is FunnelWeb, a menu-driven operating environment for the TI-99 developed in Australia by Tony and Will McGovern in the mid-80s. What you could actually do with the GUI on the TI-99 was pretty limited by the fact that most users didn't have a mouse. The best most folks ever had was a Wiko trackball on the joystick port. So with mice not a thing, FunnelWeb's menu navigation is all hotkey-based. Still, it's a noble attempt to tie together all the core functions of a TI-99 in one interface. Even if personally, I can't help but feel that on a keyboard, a command prompt just makes more sense. Regardless, 4A DOS and FunnelWeb were both rather late to the party, showing up long after the TI-99 heyday had ended. So there was only so big a mark either of them could make on the platform. But ultimately, the reason I'm talking about this disk operating system stuff today isn't anything that happened in the 80s. It isn't 4A DOS trying its hand at the DOS thing, or Morningstar bringing CP/M to the TI-99, or even FunnelWeb giving the TI-99 a menu-driven operating environment. I'm talking about disk operating systems today because Matt Splett's Force Command came to the TI-99 a whole lot more recently. And it's kept on getting better and doing more as time's gone by. So let's look at Force Command and the cool things it can do on today's TI-99 hardware. No rare CP/M boards or 80-column cards required. Like 4A DOS, Force Command runs from the cartridge slot, so I'd recommend using it from a Final Grom flash card. It's a piece of hardware Force Command integrates with really well. Card aside, the only piece of hardware you'll absolutely need to use Force Command is the 32K RAM expansion. But, like I tend to say, that's a requirement for pretty much anything on the TI-99. If you want to use a TI-99 for anything other than playing Parsec and Munchman or that sort of thing, well, you need the 32K. Finally, on top of that, well, it'd be pretty dumb to use a disk operating system without any disks. So, if you haven't got a disk solution, I'd worry about that first. With the top TI-99 disk solution these days being the Tippy. Since both Force Command and the Tippy were created by Matt, they do a great job of exposing each other's features. So, while the Tippy's optional, it's something you'll probably really want to have. And there are a couple other pieces of hardware that definitely fall into this optional but nice to have category that you might really want to have, but you don't absolutely need to use Force Command in the first place. And the first of those optional bits is an F18A VDP, the video processor upgrade that replaces the 9918A in the TI-99. That upgrade, most importantly, gives you an 80-column graphics mode, and more palette options too. So, you'll surely be happy to have those options if you've got an F18A. The final upgrade you might really want to have is the Super Asgard Memory System, SAMS. Without SAMS, Force Command doesn't store your command history. And just like I'd have a hard time using MS-DOS without DOSKey doing command history, I'd have a hard time giving up command history here. So that's definitely another upgrade that, while you don't absolutely need it, you might really, really want. Now the first thing you'll actually do with Force Command once you've got it on a cart is, of course, start the damn thing up. But what happens then is up to you. Just like 4A DOS, Force Command has an auto-exec file called AutoCMD. and you can put in there any commands you want to run at startup. So your options there include pretty much anything in the command set. But one thing a lot of people will do is display a menu and prompt the user for any startup options they might like to choose. And you can get really fancy here if you wanna. Force Command supports ANSI escape codes, so you can use color and spacing and ANSI code page characters to your heart's content. Which is how my start screen here ends up with a Munchman and a TI Invader on it. It's in 80-column mode there with the help of an F18A VDP, but you can switch to 40-column mode anytime you wish with the width command. If you want to use any ANSI art under Force Command, you probably want to put it together with a program like PabloDraw. PabloDraw is what I've been using to edit my menus anyway, and it's worked well enough for me. You aren't obliged to go to all the trouble of putting together ANSI art just to get a menu, though, since the FC menu utility that comes with the package gives you a much quicker, much simpler way to generate simple, fast text menus. FC menu uses a config file where you store a list of hotkeys, names, and commands in that order, and using that, it generates your menu and handles input for the sake of picking an option. And you can even chain submenus with FC menu commands calling other FC menu files, so you can have, say, a games menu that you get to from your main menu with a hotkey. No ANSI art and complicated scripting in this case, though, so even though it's slower to load, I found it hard to resist the urge to make a menu of my own in AutoCommand. And I also couldn't resist the urge to take advantage of Force Command's palette options. And that starts with the color command, which lets you set the default foreground and background color to anything you'd like. As far as your options go, there are a few different color combos you see a lot in the TI-99 sphere. There's black on cyan, there's white on dark blue, and sometimes a few other combinations, like black on green or white on black. At any rate, in Force Command, you can pick whatever combination you like, with color 15.1 being white on black, for example, or color 1.7 being black on cyan. Personally, I go for white on black pretty much every time. There are only so many color combos that aren't terrible on the 15-color TI-99 palette. But you can pick any of them, even the terrible ones, I guess, if you just really want to suffer. But there are more and even better options if you've got an F18A in your VDP socket. For F18A owners, Force Command gives you the option to use a palette command to set the machine's 15-color palette to pretty much anything. Those palette values are handled as 12-bit RGB, which is to say every color is defined as 3 4-bit values. One for red, one for green, and one for blue. Write each of those values for each of those colors as a hex digit, and you get a palette command like this one. And to be clear, these changes stick around until reset, so these can change the palette for any software you use in any way you please, for better or worse. That's how I got myself playing Munchman using more of a Pac-Man palette recently. And I think Hunt the Wumpus also works really well in my version of night mode. You really feel like you're rooting around in dark caves. Freaky bastard, that Wumpus. But obviously, messing around with the computer's palette isn't the main function of a disk operating system. Running programs and manipulating files tends to be the higher priority. And Force Command gives you good ways of doing that too. People mostly run programs in one or two ways these days on a TI-99. Either via the cartridge port, usually with the Final Grom flash card in that case, or via disk, usually with the Tippy in that case. And Force Command supports both those options nicely. For cart software, you can load Final Grom images right from the command prompt with the FG99 command. So, if there's a cart ROM called stevie.bin on your Final Grom for the Stevie editor, FG99 Stevie loads it up and restarts with the software ready to go. On the other hand, the load command loads disk software, EA5 files as we tend to call them, traditionally being loaded with option 5 on the editor assembler cart. But typing a single command under force command sure beats that solution in the present day. So this is how you can have a mix of dozens of different cart and disk software titles on a force command menu. And as popular as loading cart images with the final GROM has been lately, having a proper disk operating system like this one makes a strong argument for loading from disk. But there is, of course, one more category of software you might need to load on a TI-99, and that is basic software. For that, you've got the XB command. This uses an extended basic cart image on your final GROM, so you need an image located there and named correctly if you want this to work. Also, you may want to set an environment variable if you want to load a custom extended basic version like RXB. But as important as running programs is, surely managing disks and files is even more central to the whole business of being a disk operating system. So, naturally, force command lets you do that too. As I've said, the modern option for TI-99 disk access that gets the most use these days is the TIPI, and that hosts your disks on a connected Raspberry Pi. But the Nano PEB and CF7 Plus still have users, partly because they're cheaper than the TIPI, and those emulate 3 disks hosted on a CF card instead. In each of those cases, the device can store more disks than you'll ever need, and the business of using them is really more just about managing how they're mapped at any given time. Happily, force command handles that conveniently right from the command line for both solutions. The CF mount command assigns CF volumes to TI disks, and the TIPI map command assigns TIPI directories to them. Plus, if you want to see all the drives and devices you have available, you can use the drives command. In that list, TIPI is the TIPI's root directory, and you can see how, in keeping with TI-99 convention, a dot separates devices and directories. The backslash used by MS-DOS as a separator was never an option on the TI, given the TI-99-4 didn't even have a backslash on the keyboard. Though naturally it did have a forward slash, or it wouldn't have been able to type its own name. And that forward slash did get used a fair bit as a file separator back in the day in TI file management. But back to force command, where files and directories are concerned, you've got all the commands you'd expect. For directories, you've got dir to catalog a directory, mkdir to make one, and rmdir to remove one. Then for files, you've got delete to get rid of a file, protect to make sure that doesn't happen, unprotect to undo that, and rename to rename it. The most recent addition to force command, just as I record this, debuted in version 1.28, and that is Matt's Virgil99 Gemini browser. Gemini is a pretty new internet content protocol that's designed to be lightweight and suitable to limited hardware, like our humble but nonetheless internet-connected TIPI-powered TI-99, for example. So I like what this browser represents for the TI-99. Since one of the major features of the TIPI is its mouse support, Virgil99 is a mouse-driven application, so you really do get about as close to a web browsing experience on the TI-99 as you could ever hope for. For browsing via HTTP on the TI-99, there is also Stewart's web browser. But the upside and downside of that is that it uses a custom markup specific to the TI-99. So content is suited to the platform, but, well, content is always going to be almost non-existent, since it's TI-99 only. And there are dozens of us. Gemini, on the other hand, is a cross-platform solution and already has thousands of sites. So there's plenty of content out there to be enjoyed, and it's probably only going to grow from here. For someone who just wants to play some kart games and do a little coding in BASIC, you probably don't need a disk operating system on your TI-99 4A. The Final Grom really is the final answer when it comes to running kart software, if that's all you want to do. But on the other hand, for the power users who want all the little extras that add-ons like the Tippy and the F-18A and SAMs make possible, well, Force Command really ties things together nicely. It treats those upgrades as optional, so you can still use it on any old TI-99 with the 32K expansion, but it really takes advantage of that extra hardware if it's there. So my question to you is, do you already use Force Command, or do you plan to? There's plenty of room to make it your own with scripts and menus, so I'd be interested to know what people are doing with it out there. Tell me about it. Thanks for watching, folks. If you'd like to see more of my TI-99 computing and gaming and history content in the future, hit subscribe. And I'll keep the updates coming. See you next time.